Yes, please.
Just a lot of what you were proposing as solutions, people on the panel involves replacing technology with, in fact that seems to be the bulk of what the suggestions involved, moving over to less polluting technologies. But what if, and people sort of voluntarily making changes to their lifestyle, what if science doesn't come to the rescue, for example, and can't find greener technologies, or people are unwilling to make the changes of their own bats? What happens then?
Okay, so what if technology doesn't come to our rescue? Ian, your thoughts on this?
Well, we know there are a lot of technologies that can help. I've been saying all along that technology cannot be the answer if we continue to consume more and more. So if we want to increase our throwaway society and travel more and more, it cannot ever answer the problem. So to me, it's essential that some sort of behavioural change is required as well. Slightly glibly, if someone asks me what can technology do, I say, well, thermal underwear is good. And that's sort of the stuff that's required to actually tackle this problem. Your second bit is if we refuse to do it, well, the future's very bleak indeed. We'll carry on burning fossil fuels until, well, we don't know until when. What's the worst? The worst that can happen is there's another mass extinction. I hope we come to our senses long before that day.
Okay, Scott.
It's to me, I'm a simple guy, and so it's a simple answer, and that is you have to have both. You have to have behavioral changes, and this is why I was just in the recycling thing, that even if recycling doesn't have a huge impact immediately, if you get into the attitude just that people start to recycle, my kids know much more about this now than I did when I was their age. And then you have to have the technology as well. And I will point to something, I'm interested in the panel's reaction to this, which is that when I was growing up in the States, going back maybe 40 years ago, so if you go back to 1970, where would we be in 2010, one of the major issues was pollution, air and water pollution. And there were changes in technology. Once the economics was there to almost force companies to make the changes, once the penalties were in place, that automobiles are much cleaner than they were 40 years ago. That factories are much cleaner than they were 40 years ago. Well, we've got much bigger problems than simply pollution, as big as that was. And so there will have to be a combination of behavioral changes, some of which are voluntary on our part, and some of which are changes in technology which are encouraged, not only by saying you can make vast profits off of this notion of green technology, but that we have to change our economic system to penalize those who do not innovate, who do not advance in some way. Otherwise, we do face the prospects that Ian spelled out.
Well, Roger, should we rely on technology in the first place? Is that how we go on the issue?
Well, to strike an optimistic note, most of the technology we need, we already have. We don't need some massive advance in science to produce insulation and the low carbon way of generating electricity and so on. We've pretty well got it. And to strike another optimistic note, I actually think that if you vision forward to a sort of low carbon world, it's actually a much more pleasant world to live in. It's a world where everyone's house is warm, don't have fuel poverty. It's a world where we probably spend less time travelling around, and I don't think that's travelling around this city is can often be a quite frustrating experience. It's a world where we eat more healthily, and a world where we are fitter. Now, that all seems to me a more pleasant world, and it's one where we can get there with existing technology. There's actually very little. Perhaps carbon capture and storage needs to be bottomed out so that we can still use some coal. But apart from that, we're pretty well there. And things that we do develop in the future are bonuses.
Okay, got a few hands. Yes, that young lady up there.
It's got partly to do with what the panel was saying about not having enough money for free public transport, but do you not think that, considering we've got a government who's got enough money to bail out the banks, enough money to pay themselves enormous expenses and buy duck houses, yet hasn't got enough money to keep open the only wind turbine plant in this country, Vestas, then surely calling for, getting behind the campaign around Vestas and the demand for 1 million green jobs that's come from that, and run a campaign about climate change is really the most important thing?
So did you correct?
Well, I certainly think we should be looking at wind and wave power, and we're ideally placed as an island to do that. And wind is an interesting thing, because if you go to Holland on holiday and you see a windmill, everybody says, oh, isn't that pretty? Isn't that lovely? You might even stand there and have your photo taken by it. Then you see a wind farm across the hills here with lots of these modern light things, and everybody goes, oh, isn't that awful? And I think somehow we need to do something to make it far more acceptable. And one of the ways is to have it much smaller. And this is all to do with microgeneration, to have the power being made where you need it. And so therefore, if you go for far more smaller things like that, and biomass generators as well that you have near farms, so you're not moving the stuff around, I think that's certainly one of the answers. But could I just raise something else, which when the other question was on? In a way, I have to say, I think the title of this is not the right title. And I think we maybe need to look at what is the elephant in the room. The question isn't how old are we going to be in 2050. The question, I think, is how many of us are there going to be? And that is really the problem, isn't it? There are too many of us. But what is anyone going to do about that? That is just the impossible subject to tackle. But the fact is, there are getting to be too many people in the world.
Okay, Ralph, I see you tapping your paper there. If you want to.
I would just like to follow that up on wind farms, because I happened to notice that in Spain they hit a remarkable target about a month ago, whereby 53% of their power on a certain Sunday was developed entirely from wind energy. And this was hailed as a great breakthrough. By the way, that 53% was on a Sunday, and I think they're mainly Catholics in Spain, so the power requirements were incredibly low on that particular. So the wind naturally was creating, it was a damn windy day as well. The average is still, by the standards of the people on my right, wonderful. In other words, they develop on average about 12% from wind farms, which is a lot more than we do. We develop about 2% or less. We're not yet up to 2%. And all I would say there is if we went any further than that, if we went anywhere near some of these continental countries, we'd have to have a lot more power from gas-fired stations to cover the loss. You know, if the when the wind's not blowing, you need to cover the power requirements, especially in the middle of winter, not on a sunny day in Spain.
Okay, introduce to Alison. Thanks very much for that. I will start with, I wouldn't ask you a question just yet. Scott, if you could...
If you want me to be provocative in response to what I think is an excellent point, I noticed, we'll turn this back, there's three political parties here, there's a fourth that isn't, which happens to be the party in power. If you took the money that had been spent on interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan since 2001, and you put that money into public transport and other infrastructure, think about where we could be. But that's a very provocative. The fact of the matter is, in part, that's a political question. You can make your choice at the election coming up next year as to which party is going to be responsible in terms of judging on priorities. But my wider point is this. If we had sat and devoted as much rhetoric to the war for resources, to the war for a more equitable and cleaner planet, as we did to talking about the war on terror, we would be in a lot better position 8 years on. And I say that as someone who comes from the States, and I know the impact of 9/11, but I'm going to put this to you in another way. In 1984, there was an incident at a place called Bhopal, which had to do with chemical production in another country. And far more people died on that day, either immediately on that day or afterwards, because of what had happened then. So while recognizing that there are serious issues for governments like wars and interventions, if we're seriously going to talk about what you're doing, deal with it. Spend the money on infrastructure, spend the money on the people who basically are going to be making a difference in the long term.
Okay.